overlay New Zealand art room?
Wait outside, both of you. One of the biggest challenges with terrorism is defining it. And this is going to relate talking about both non-state terrorism, this means terrorist groups, anyone who isn't a state, and states. Because if we change the way we define it, we change who can count as a terrorist. This PowerPoint is on my classes, and there's lots of slabs like this of definitions. In particular, the threat of violence by individuals, subnational groups, meaning below the level of a state or nation, and state actors. So this particular author is suggesting all three can be terrorist groups, can do terrorism, the act of terrorism. Individuals, groups below the level of the nation, and the nation itself. Not everyone would agree with this. Not everyone agrees that a state can be terrorist in nature. But the three elements of defining terrorism are all here. One, it's violent in nature. Two, it has political objectives. And three, it almost always targets civilians or some sort of victims. So those three elements are agreed upon. There are other elements which are more controversial. Wait outside. Three prompts for you to respond to. No more than a sentence. Try your own one-sentence definition. Your own one-sentence answer to who you think could be terrorists. And one sentence on, can it ever be justified?
I can't see the color. Should I like tell this one during no what? I can read the PowerPoint. Wait, guys, maybe. What if men grew up terrorists? Wait, guys, switch seats.
Now, I should say to the three of you as well, there's no questions for the lesson. So it's following what I'm doing the questions on the screen.
Could I just pick up my book now? I just have time, so I'll just hang it up.
Inevitably, in defining it, you're going to leave something out. You're making a conscious decision to count something and discount something else. And that's the dispute about defining terrorism, about what is and isn't terrorism. It's you deciding what counts as a terrorist act. Likewise, around who can be a terrorist. Most people would agree that Al-Qaeda and Jemaah Islamiyah are terrorists. People probably wouldn't agree that George Bush, Obama, John Howard are terrorists. So why is it that different people disagree about what a terrorist is? This cartoon captures that question around whether a state can be a terrorist. You've got the man in the middle representing an American, a Westerner, looking at this guy on the ground saying, just another terrorist who wants to destroy us. That potential terrorist is saying, no, I'm just hungry. You're misreading who I am and what it is I'm doing. And this statement is one which is often used to talk about defining terrorism. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. So this encapsulates that debate. The Sunni and Shia insurgents, the Americans would see them as terrorists. They're letting off car bombs. They're killing civilians in markets. Last night, 18 in a market, the biggest market in Baghdad. If you ask some Sunnis and Shias in Iraq, they would say, no, these are freedom fighters. They're fighting to free us from occupation. So it's a matter of perspective. And the same can be said of states. One person will see what a state does and says, look, they're a terrorist state. They're intentionally killing civilians, they're causing terror. Another person will look at them and say, no, they're freeing us from those bad people. In its simplest form, this person nuts it down to the political objectives that relate to terrorism. So a terrorist attack isn't about that actual attack. It's about the message associated with that attack. The attack on September 11th against the Twin Towers wasn't because the terrorists didn't like the people in the towers. It was a political message that had an objective in mind to bring attention towards their cause. So there are always political objectives. The same isn't true in war. There are political objectives in war, but in war, blowing up a tank is blowing up a tank to win the battle. With terrorism, there's an alternative objective which is separate from that incident. Bali bombings. It wasn't because Jemaah Islamiyah didn't like the people dancing in the nightclubs. They don't like Westerners, they want Westerners out of Indonesia. So that was the political statement. The US government has a slightly different definition. And I've underlined what it is that they're trying to focus on in their definition. Premeditated, meaning planned. Politically motivated. Violence. Violence which is caused against non-combatants, so civilians. But the key to their definition is that they will only focus on subnational groups. Individuals, groups. Their definition doesn't recognise states as terrorist actors. So people put things in definitions and take them out depending on what they think counts. And the premeditated part isn't accidental either. Premeditated means intentional. So what they're saying is if a US bomber aircraft accidentally drops bombs on a school, that's not terrorism. Yes, we killed civilians, but it wasn't premeditated. We didn't mean to do that. They're saying the difference is a terrorist intends to do just that. So in their definition, intention matters. Another one which emphasises the the fact that states shouldn't be included, but again it's by a US group. So once again they're leaving out the fact that states might be called terrorist states. Interesting bit at the end that it's intended to influence an audience. So whilst it may in fact kill a group of people, that terrorist incident, that's not its intention. Its intention is influence, it's political, it's elsewhere. So they might blow up a school bus somewhere, but in fact the effect they want to have isn't to those people, the effect is elsewhere. They want the effect to occur in the media, to occur in the mindsets of different people. And again, it's worth emphasising this political change part, because when we start talking about the causes of terrorism, the one which is the best for us is political causes. Why does it occur? Because people want to bring about some sort of political change. It's too simplistic to say terrorists are crazy or terrorists are evil. That doesn't tell us enough. We need to be more sophisticated than that. They have a purpose. And their purpose is change, some sort of political change. We might not like the way they go about it or what change they want, but they have goals. They're not random acts of violence. They do things purposefully, and it's with change in mind. And we know Jamara Islamiyah is an example of that. They want change. They want Westerners out of that region. They want a pan-Islamic state across the whole region with Sharia law. So that's political. Unless you need to go to the bathroom, you don't ask questions. Okay.
The word jihad is mentioned in the Quran about 41 times. The words mercy, peace and compassion are mentioned about 355 times. Yes, come in. Come on in, Riaz. Sit down, please. Contrary to popular belief in most Western cultures, Islam is a religion that preaches peace and tolerance. Yes, Patricia.
If Islam truly is a religion that preaches peace, then how come the world's most troubled spots, the West Bank, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, they're all plagued with Islamic terrorism?
Well, that depends on your definition of terrorism. Some might argue that the US invasions of countries like Iraq and Afghanistan are also acts of terrorism.
Those were acts of war to get rid of despotic regimes.
Or a means of getting at a country's oil.
Conspiracy theories.
Well,
may I?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Prince.
Mr. Khan is right. I mean, if we're talking about terrorists, the world's biggest terrorists are the white superpowers.
Come on now.
No, really, stop and think about it.
Explain 9/11.
Okay. Do you know how many people died in the Twin Towers strike?
Around 3,000.
And do you have any idea how many people died in the bombing of Afghanistan? Take a wild guess. More than 15,000 people died, and that's just conservative figures. About 50,000 tons of explosives were dropped on innocent civilians. Men, women, children.
Yeah, but that was because of the Taliban.
Now that you brought it up, did you know that the Taliban was a creation of the CIA? To fight the Russians.
Whatever. They were still harboring terrorists.
Yeah, right. Terrorists that were never found. Just like the weapons of mass destruction that were never found in Iraq. Do you want to get into the death toll in Iraq? 500,000 civilians and counting. And what do Britain and America say when they don't find these weapons? It's simple. They just say sorry. And still refuse to relinquish control of these countries.
What are you trying to say?
What I'm trying to say is that just because you're American, wear a fancy suit, and call yourself the president, doesn't make you any less of a terrorist. I'm saying that if you don't stop meddling in other people's countries, you will face a backlash.
If Muslims like you feel that way, then why don't you get out of our country?
We will. As soon as you promise to leave ours.
The author of that obviously has a particular view about defining terrorism. And he explicitly states it. He's suggesting that George Bush is as much of a terrorist and white leaders in suits are capable of as much terrorism as Muslim fundamentalists. And he explores that idea through a conversation between 3 or 4 different characters. He uses the specific context of the current wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and discussion around Muslims and whether they're inherently violent or whether there's something causing them to be violent. So if we come back to this main question, which this PowerPoint is really about, what is terrorism? We can go to the UN, and they attempted to define it. So our institution of global governance, the institution we have which tries to understand these things and writes international law, came together, and they couldn't agree on definition. The problem they had was about including states. The UN is primarily made up of states. And many states did not like the idea that they too could be included as conducting terrorist acts, that someone could point the finger at them and use an official definition to label what they've done as terrorist. However, they did say that there were common themes that came out in most discussions around terrorism. Undeniably, it has to involve some element of violence or the threat of violence. There are political objectives. So as I've mentioned before, it's not about that particular battle. It's not a military objective to win one particular conflict. It's political. It's about power. And it has to focus on civilians. So if you're talking about the US Army bombing a Syrian airbase, not terrorism. You've got one military fighting another military. If you're talking about Al-Qaeda hijacking a plane and crashing that plane, that's focusing on civilians. That's an attack on civilians, non-combatants. So these are the most common themes that tend to be universally agreed upon. The study design actually gives us a definition. Threatened or actual use of violence to achieve political objectives can be utilised by individuals, groups and governments. One reason they say it can be used by governments is because they want us to be able to talk about state terrorism. In fact, they've called this whole unit state and non-state terrorism. And we have to be able to talk about an example of state terrorism. So they've decided states can be implicated in terrorist acts. And so we need to know two examples. We need to know an example of a religious group. That religious group will be Jamaah Islamiyah, which we already know a little bit about. And our example of a terrorist state will be Indonesia. So we're already a little bit familiar with this. All we're going to do is revise what we've done on JI and just look at two examples of what Indonesia has done in West Papua. We've touched upon it when we did Indonesia, just two specific examples where we could argue about whether they were terrorist attacks. The state using Detachment 88. So that's our religious group, our non-state actor, and that's our state actor. These particular slides just go in more detail into how the US has defined it in a certain way to exclude themselves. So literally in their law, they're saying it involves citizens, subnational groups, or other groups. And by doing that, they exclude themselves from being held accountable to their own laws, because their laws don't include states. And in a way, they don't have to include states. If they want to make war against another state, they can do that anyway. Military power. So it's a national interest move in a way. They're protecting their national interest by not letting themselves be held accountable to any definition of terrorism. And that's where this is, therefore nation states cannot be terrorists, according to their own definition. But there is an irony here, because terrorism has always been used by states. States mastered it hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. They used it really well to achieve their national interest, or at least the perceived national interest of whoever was in charge. So right now, in Syria, you've got Assad using chemical weapons against his people. So, chemical weapons, a form of violence. It's political. He doesn't really care about the civilians he's killing. It's a political message for the rest of the population. And it's in the national interest. His idea of what is best for the nation, it's the best thing in the nation to scare the separatists, scare the opposition into stopping. So states have used it for a long time. This particular image tries to suggest that often what states do is they mask their terrorism with this idea of war. What we're doing isn't terrorist. It's not an example of terrorism. It's war. We're entitled to go to war. We're a state. We're entitled to defend ourselves. And self-defense is the justification that states use. We don't want to have to attack Afghanistan and Iraq, but we have to in self-defense. Yes, we're going to kill some civilians, but they made us do it. We have to do it to change their regime, to stop the terrorist elements over there. So states have different powers available to them. They don't need to hijack planes. They don't need to use car bombs. They've got the military machine. Some of the other methods that states might use: a kangaroo court. This is an example of almost like a fake court. You set it up, you let everyone argue the cases, but the decision has already been decided long before the case started. So it's like a fake trial. Bombings. Torture is one very commonly used. And it's very commonly used because it can be kept secret. All you need to do is get someone in a prison cell and you can torture them as much as you like. Very few people are going to find out about it. Kidnappings, executions. These were used extensively during the Cold War. Particularly conservative governments, right-wing governments would collect up anyone who was socialist or communist and execute them. Or you transfer them to other countries where torture is allowed. So these are some of the methods that states currently use. All types of states. And if I flick through some of the examples, or at least put them up on the board, from the Cold War, all pre-2000, Stalin used to round up huge numbers of people and either kill them or put them in concentration camps in Siberia. During the Red Revolution in China, Mao did the same thing. Any of the elites, they rounded them up, put them in one area, or just killed them. Pol Pot, incredible example in human history. Any intellectuals, anyone who wore glasses, if you were someone who wore glasses, you were rounded up and killed. Because that was a sign of being intelligent. They wanted to get rid of everyone who was intelligent. It was a peasant revolution. So it's political. It meets that criteria. It's definitely violent. It aims to intimidate. We know about Hitler and the Nazis. Indonesia is up there. Their killings were anti-communist killings. And even though it says with US backing, it should also say with Australian and UK backing as well. We were on Suharto's side. So you can argue that the terrorism which he used was supported by the West. Why? It was in our national interest. We didn't like communists either. We didn't want a communist revolution here in Australia. So if he could stop the communists coming down through Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, good. Other examples. Pinochet is a particularly frightening one. They used to round up anyone who was communist or alleged communist. They'd put them on planes, they'd fly out into the ocean and throw them all out of the back of the plane. Allegedly hundreds of thousands. They're known as the disappeared people, or the desaparecidos. So examples of the state using fear, violence to achieve a political goal against civilians. This isn't the state going against armed militias. Civilians. More examples. But interestingly, the US State Department actually labels some other states as terrorist. So despite the fact they don't include the word state in their definition, they're still going after some states, saying these states sponsor terrorism. That means they think these states support terrorist groups. So they're still happy to go after states. They're still recognising that these states are associated with terrorism. There's this question, and it's a loaded question. And all the prompts are loaded because the answer to all of them is yes. but it's trying to establish a line of logic. Did the US support and fund the Mujahideen, which are a terrorist group, in the 80s? Yes. Did they support Saddam? We trained Saddam and gave him most of his military arms? Yes. Did we use napalm in villages in Vietnam? Yes. So the answers are all yeses. The question is, were these examples of war? The fact that some were intentional, some weren't intentional, does that mean that they're not terrorist? That's what you argue over. We should know about just war theory. We've got just cause, last resort, legitimate authority, reasonable hope of success. States can use just war theory to justify their terrorism. And here's how. They can use the idea of regular warfare to kill civilians. So violence against civilians. And then they can use just cause. They can say, we have a right to defend ourselves. We have just cause to kill these civilians. We don't particularly want to, but we have cause. The terrorists are somewhere in this city. They're somewhere in Fallujah. That was the city that was on the video last week. We don't know where they are. But if we wipe out Fallujah, we can wipe out the terrorists. We have just cause to go in, take everyone out, and we've got the terrorists. So just war theory can be used to justify a whole range of behaviour. And it sounds pretty reasonable. These terrorists are going to attack us. If we don't take them out now, we're going to lose lives. We need to protect the power of our state, the power of our sovereignty. We have just cause and the right to defend ourselves. I'm not going to read through that. And in a way, this shift that we've had in the last 11 years, 10 years, away from containment to preemption, is a really significant one. So in the past, we would contain threats. We would do our best to make sure the threats didn't get to us. But some nations have changed their approach to power, politics, violence, etc. So what the US did with Bush's doctrine, they changed the game. They said, we're going to preempt threats. We know there are terrorists in Fallujah. We're not going to wait till they come get us. We'll wipe out Fallujah. We just took out the terrorists. It's preemptive. We'll preempt a potential threat coming to us. And it's not terrorism. We might kill some civilians, but there's a threat there. So it can be used to justify an act which someone might call terrorist. Since 9/11, we've had plenty of examples which we could argue over whether they're examples of state terrorism or a state defending itself. US invading Iraq, bombing Iraq, setting up prisons where people weren't tried, they were held in prison indefinitely. You got the example in Israel of the government killing, I think it was the Lebanese leader, bulldozing Palestinian homes, bombing certain cities, all of them with just cause, saying self-defense. Admitting they were killing civilians, but using self-defense as their explanation. And the state. This is the state going in with the military. You might recognise, I should put a picture up, Mugabe, actively taking down opposition members who he claimed were terrorists. We can use this type of force because they're terrorists. We need to defend ourselves. And the most recent one, which we're going to learn a little bit more about, Indonesia. And this one's fascinating because let's presume we agree that Indonesia is being terrorist in nature. It's using Detachment 88 in West Papua. If we trained their forces, how are we implicated in this terrorism? We didn't do it, so maybe we can wipe our hands clean and say it's not our responsibility. but we've trained their forces and we know they're doing it. So does that make us a third party? Does it make us guilty but not terrorist? Or is it not terrorism at all? Is this simply me being too idealistic, and this is realism, a state defending its power and authority, defending its territory? Sudan, etc. So these are the questions I'd like you to address. Is terrorism war? Is it something different? Does it even matter? Can the actions of states be labelled terrorist? State and non-state terrorism, which one's a greater threat? Can it ever be justified? The PowerPoint's on my classes. I suggest you get it now because you should be referring back up to some of the quotes and some of the material in it.